afternoon to everybody. I'll start now by first apologizing to the speaker for scheduling him on January 20th when it's inauguration day, and I'm certain that lots of people are sort of listening, or we just finished listening to the inaugural address and sort of making their evaluations of it. So some of people are breathing a sigh of relief, other people are sort of thinking otherwise. So this is not the most propitious time to be giving a talk. But I'm so grateful that Dean Seeger has taken time from his busy schedule to be part of the Humanities Center Brown-Bach series. He is an example of what I call the scholar administrator. His administration credentials are quite obvious. I mean, he is a senior dean here at Wayne State University. The fact that he has served so long and has the respect of all the other deans and the presidents and provosts is a tribute to his skill and effectiveness as an administrator. He and I go back a long, long way when he was a bright young star in the graduate school way back, and I was the old sage in the graduate school. And then he went on to all this glory, and I've watched him with great admiration rise through the ranks and become such an important administrator on this campus. But he is also a well-known, highly respected scholar. He is a professor of communication and dean of the College of Fine Performing and Communication Arts. His research concerns crisis and risk communication, health promotion and communication, crisis response and agency coordination, the role of media, including new media, crisis and communication ethics, failure of complex systems, and post-crisis renewal. So he has a wide intellectual portfolio, and his work has addressed all of these areas. He has worked with the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, and he's a member of the World Health Organization Guideline Development Group for Emergency Risk Communication. He has consulted with several Fortune 500 firms on crisis management, planning, and response. His work has been supported by the CDC, NCFPD, NSF, NIH, and the state of Michigan. He is currently involved in a multi-year interdisciplinary project focusing on critical infrastructures and the creation of resilience. His work has appeared in over 200 journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings. His books include, there are many, Communication and Organizational Crisis, published in 2003, Crisis Communication and Public Health, published in 2008, Effective Crisis Communication, published in 2007, Effective Risk Communication, published in 2009, Theorizing Crisis Communication, published in 2014, Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication, which is a second edition, published in 2015, Narratives of Crisis, Stories of Ruin and Renewal, published in 2016, and the International Handbook of Crisis Communication, published in 2016. He is the founding editor of the Journal of International Crisis and Risk Communication. He has been quoted by the Washington Post, New York Times, Atlanta Journal Communication, Constitution, and Rolling Stones. He has advised over 40 doctoral dissertations in the area of risk and crisis communications. He is a recipient of the National Communication Association's Service Engagement Award and the Gerald M. Phillips Award for Distinguished Applied Communication Scholarship. And he is a member of the Public Relations Society of America Detroit Chapter's Hall of Fame. So you're in the presence of a very busy, engaged scholar and also a notable, highly respected, highly efficient administrator who has taken time to talk to us today on his topic, communication, organization, and COVID-19. So I am delighted to yield the floor to Professor Matthew Seeger.
Thank you very much, Walter. Maybe we should just stop right there, with all of that. So I really appreciate you inviting me. Of course, Walter and I go way back, and he has been a model for me for many, many years, a mentor, and I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to work with you, Walter. The Humanities Center, of course, is a real gem, and it is a gem largely because of your commitment. I also want to thank all of our participants today. So many good friends on the call that I see. I really appreciate you taking time away from the televised salvation of democracy and the wonderful celebration that we've seen. Lady Gaga is the next president, I hope. She was amazing this morning, but I really appreciate folks taking the time to hear me today. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you'll be able to see my slides when I do so. Just give me a moment to figure this out. And I have some slides that I think you will find helpful in following some of my work in the area of crisis and emergency risk communication. So I hope you can see my slides now. I have been doing this work for a very long time. I've been working in the area of crisis and risk communication for over 40 years now, which is a very frightening thing to think about. But my work from my dissertation forward has followed this area. And I like to think about my career as a career in crisis, not necessarily because the career has been so disruptive, but that there's a lot of work to be done in this particular area. So as I have worked over this 40 years, I've tried to work on expanding the parameters of what we think of as crisis studies or crisis communication. When I began this work, there was a focus primarily on just what happened immediately after a crisis. But as you'll hear, I've tried to expand our understanding of crisis. I've also been very interested in theorizing about crisis, and several of my works and 2 of my books focus on crisis theory. I wanted to name one of my books Recipes for Disaster, which is this Far Side comic, but my publisher would not let me do so. But I do think we do need to spend some time theorizing around crisis. It's been primarily a field that's driven by personal experience and anecdote as opposed to theory, and theory I think is important to understanding these events. Crisis is also very event-driven. I sometimes joke that the worst of times is the best of times for the crisis communication scholar, because events like 9/11, the Ebola crisis, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the Exxon Valdez, the Flint water crisis, the Camp Fires in California. These events have really driven our understanding of crisis and crisis communication. Disasters and crises are also forces of very profound social change. And certainly we've seen that in COVID-19. We've seen that with other events. So much change was driven by 9/11. We had the largest reorganization of the federal government since World War II as a consequence of 9/11. Hurricane Katrina changed so much fundamental understanding of risks that we face and drove a lot of demographic changes. So these are forces of very profound social change. And the last point I would make is that, my focus has been on communication, in large part because communication is just so fundamentally essential to both understanding and managing these particular events. I like to ask my friends in emergency management, how would you ever manage an event without communicating? So communication is really essential to these events. So what I'd like to do today is, provide just a really quick overview of some principles of crisis communication. I'll try to keep that focused and short. As I said, I've been working in this field for a very long time. I have a lot to say, and I'm often reminded that I say too much. So I will try to keep my remarks relatively focused so there's time for some discussion. But I do tend to prattle on when we start talking about bad things. I'm great fun at a party. I'd also like to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that are underway. These are works in progress around COVID-19. And as I said, much of the work in crisis is driven by events. And one of my approaches to studying and understanding crisis has been to try to get into these events as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, because our understanding really changes as an event evolves over time. So I think it's important for the crisis scholar to try to engage in these events early in their development so that we can understand them. So I'm going to talk about two projects. One is communicating death and dying and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's an interesting book chapter that we recently finished with one of my graduate students. And the other is a project which is ongoing, which is a multi-institutional collaborative on higher education response to COVID-19. So let me just give a real quick orientation to crisis communication. Crisis communication is a process, and it occurs throughout the crisis stage. It's not just after an event occurs, but it's in the planning stage, it's in the development and disseminating of information and persuasive messages. And these messages are designed to avoid, contain, and manage the harm. So we really think of crisis communication as an extensive process, both informative and persuasive, which occurs throughout the life cycle of a crisis. When we think of conditions of crisis, there are some important things to keep in mind. First of all, a crisis involves a fundamental disruption of what we think of as normal. So all of our structures and systems and procedures and relationships and roles and procedures that we use to constitute our lives are disrupted around a crisis. And I think we certainly can see that around COVID-19. We're all living on Zoom now. We're ordering our food from the grocery store and picking it up. We're wearing masks in public. So our interactions with our work, with our friends, with our neighbors, our family have all been changed. So there's been a fundamental disruption of our lives and our sense of normalcy. It's also a well-documented phenomenon of social amplification of risk. And this is the tendency of communication systems to amplify risk factors in ways that are disproportional to the actual risk that is faced. So for example, we had great concern about Ebola and how Ebola was going to create very significant public health threats in this country. But in reality, the Ebola risk was really quite limited. So the perception of Ebola as a risk factor was wildly disproportional to the actual risk. We've seen an interesting phenomena in COVID-19, which hasn't been really examined as much, and that's social minimization of risk. This is where we tend to discount things that are really truly risky and not, again, have a risk perception that is proportional to the actual risk. COVID-19 has also been characterized by misinformation and distortion, and I'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment. Crises and disasters, there's always problems with accuracy of information, there's always distortion, but COVID-19 has really pushed that to a very different level. And I'll talk about that again in a moment. The myth of panic is pretty well documented in disaster work. There is a widespread belief that if we actually give the public accurate information about what's going on in a risk situation, they will somehow panic, they will run back into burning buildings, they will do all kinds of things that are illogical and irrational, and that will create more harm. And in fact, President Trump, you may remember him, he's the former president of the United States. President Trump used the myth of panic specifically as a justification for withholding information from the public about the real risk of COVID-19, because he didn't want people to panic. Well, the reality is that people rarely panic in a crisis situation. They usually respond in much more logical and rational ways. The bigger problem is getting the public to pay attention around a crisis circumstance. We also often have in crises cascading impacts. So we'll have an initial disruption, which will impact something else and then something else. Certainly, we've seen that in COVID-19 with the disruption of the pandemic, which then led to an economic problem. One of the best examples of cascading impacts is the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, nuclear disaster, where we had an earthquake, which created a tsunami, which created an industrial accident, which created a radiation leak, which created a food crisis, food contamination event, and also created an energy crisis in Japan. So we had a lot of cascading impacts from that initial disruption. We also have secondary disruptions, where these are things that happen secondarily to the crisis, which contribute to the overall harm. And with crisis, we often have stigmatization. Certainly we have that in COVID-19. We have had lots of efforts to associate COVID-19 with particular ethnic groups and stigmatizing those groups in that way. So some of the work that I've done over the years involves helping develop crisis communication materials for various agencies, including the Centers for Disease Control. We helped develop the Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication Framework for the Centers of Disease Control, which really set a very high standard for how we should communicate around a public health crisis. Unfortunately, none of this was followed in COVID-19. And in fact, some of my colleagues and former students at the Centers for Disease Control indicated that the entire communication around COVID-19 was taken away from the subject matter experts, and none of those procedures that we had put in place were really followed around COVID-19. As part of this work, we developed a model for understanding a crisis and emergency communication across the life cycle of an event. So from the pre-crisis stage, which are those very early stages before a disruption occurs, where we try to educate people about risks, where we develop warning systems, where we build and test communications, all systems, all the way to the evaluation process, where we try to talk about lessons learned. So this is an illustration of some of the work I've done to try to expand the notion of what constitutes crisis communication beyond simply talking about what happens after an event occurs. You see from this model that communication is part of the entire process of a crisis as it evolves over time. I also was fortunate to be involved with a lot of work with the World Health Organization, which is likely to be reactivated now. As you may know, the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization under the former President Trump. And now the US is planning to re-engage with the World Health Organization. So they're interested in exploring some of these things again. But as part of that work, we developed some basic principles, or articulated some basic principles around crisis communication and public health. The first is to acknowledge high uncertainty. I had a really interesting conversation with the provost yesterday about uncertainty in crisis conditions and the incredible uncertainty we face right now around COVID-19 and the vaccines and when we can come back as a university face-to-face. So we really face a lot of uncertainty around this particular circumstance. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to develop strategies to work within what is a very high uncertainty context. We also need to be able to address rumors, and there are amazing numbers of rumors around COVID-19. I could go on and on about that for some time. We need to acknowledge the high levels of threat that people are perceiving around emergencies, health emergencies. Our messaging needs to be consistent and credible, and of course, this is something that was missing from COVID-19. We need to promote self-efficacy by giving people actionable information. We need to give people things that they can actually do to reduce their risk. That helps give people a sense of personal control over the disasters that they are facing, the risks that they are facing. Sometimes in a crisis situation, we tell people to do things that they can't do. So, for example, in COVID-19, we told people to stay at home and be socially distant. Well, if my livelihood demands that I go out and work, or if I live in a multi-generational household, I can't do those things. So it's not really helpful. It's not actionable information if I tell people to do things that they can't actually do. Our messages need to be simple and understandable. During a crisis situation, our capacity to process complicated information is reduced. So we need to have very clear, very simple, straightforward messages. And some of the messages that we see around COVID-19 are not simple nor understandable. When we start talking about the nature of the virus and the nature of the vaccine, or we tell people to avoid congregate settings, that's not necessarily language that the average person is going to be able to understand. We need to be timely and tailored in our messages. Our messages need to meet the moment of the crisis, and they need to be tailored to meet the audience needs. So those are some of the principles of effective crisis communication that we worked to develop with the Centers for Disease Control. I'll talk about some of these a little bit more later on. One of the ways in which we understand crises, such as public health crises, is through recent events that we've experienced. So perhaps some of you have encountered someone who has said, oh, COVID-19 isn't all that bad. It's just a bad flu, and it's just like the flu. So we really don't worry about it because it's just a different kind of flu. So some of the recent events that we have experienced, public health events, the Sars events, some of you may remember that. That involved Detroit. The Sars came into this country through Canada, came across the border from Windsor into Detroit, and we had several cases of Sars, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, which is also a COVID virus in Detroit. The MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, was in 2012, 400 deaths associated with that. Ebola was quite interesting. You may remember that this was a huge promoted, wildly disproportional to the level of risk. There were only 11 cases of Ebola in the US and only one example of a person-to-person transmission of Ebola in the US. And then our seasonal influenza, we have about 80,000 deaths in an average year from seasonal influenza. So a couple of things about these, first of all, these numbers of deaths are really quite small compared to what we've seen around COVID-19. So the public, I think, is used to, based on their experience, not seeing a high degree of mortality associated with these diseases. And the most common of these diseases that, that we experience is seasonal influenza. And again, that's sort of a background for most of us threat. Most of us, about 50% of us, get our seasonal influenza vaccine. So we're used to dealing with that. It's familiar. It's not something that's novel or new. COVID-19, however, is novel. It is a novel virus. We don't necessarily understand this virus as it first was emerging. We had little information about it. We didn't understand what was going on. We were unable to give the public a great deal of information about the specific nature of the virus. It's also unfair in the sense that it does not attack people based on their own behaviors necessarily. Some people get the virus and get sick, and they're just fine. Some people get the virus and they have no symptoms. Some people get the virus and they get very, very sick. So the virus is very unfair in terms of how it affects individuals. There's not a sense of some pattern or fairness in that. Its origins are exotic. It came here from overseas. It's been attributed to several different animal hosts, including bats. So certainly that creates a perception of an exotic origin. There is stigmatization, as I mentioned earlier, particularly with some ethnic and immigrant communities associated with the virus. It's involuntary, unlike some risks such as smoking. This isn't something that I necessarily chose. It's not a function of behavior. And again, this virus has created a great deal of uncertainty in terms of how it's going to evolve, how long we're going to have to deal with it, what its impacts are going to be. It has created very significant disruption. When I put these slides together, I initially had unprecedented disruption, but I was afraid somebody from the history department might be on here and remind me of 1918 and the Spanish flu, the pandemic that may have taken 50 million lives worldwide. But certainly it has created significant disruption. It has converged with the Black Lives Matter uprisings. It has been a cascading event in terms of its implications for the economy, for organizations, for so many activities that we're engaged in. The interactions with other kinds of issues have really been unprecedented and in many ways unanticipated. The message environment around this has been very diverse. The messages are quite contradictory and conflicting. And this has been a slow-moving crisis. Most crises are relatively short in terms of their duration. This particular disaster has rolled out over a very, very long period of time. And as we have been reminded recently, we still have a long way to go before this is resolved. So, and in terms of the communication ecosystem, there are some important features around COVID-19. The first is this whole notion of fake news, that a lot of the information we're receiving is fake news. I did an interview this morning with a news outlet, and they asked me to talk about, people who were saying that COVID was a hoax and that it was all made up. And, it's very hard to get people to be concerned or get people to be vaccinated against a hoax. So the fake news phenomena has really influenced significantly how people are perceiving this event. There are many rumors associated with COVID-19. Again, the informational environment has been very politicized. We always see crises and risks that they have political dimensions, but nothing like this. This has really become a very, very politicized event. It's converged with the larger question of science denial. And in fact, at some points, some of our politicians said, we're trying to get the scientists out of this conversation. We don't want them leading the discussion. Of course, our current president, Mr. Biden, says that he will let the scientists lead the way. And the messages have been wildly conflicting. So we have a communication ecosystem and an understanding of this event that is very, very complicated based on the diversity of messages and these larger phenomena. So is in a nod to some of my colleagues who work with me now on water issues, I just want to point out that there is a really intense need for us to deploy research and science during disasters. This is a really important place where subject matter experts and those of us who are pursuing the life of the mind really need to engage in these conversations. COVID-19 was clearly an emerging science context. When the disease first emerged, we did not know what it was. We didn't know how it was transmitted. There were a lot of questions that the scientific community needed to address. We needed that information to inform our decisions and actions about how to continue on. We needed to address some of the unanticipated interactions that were occurring around the event. There was a great deal of surprise, which I'll talk about, but a great deal of surprise and just shock around what was happening. I remember quite clearly when the university decided to shut down, and back in March when the university finally concluded that we needed all to go home. And I remember some conversations with some people who were saying, gee, maybe we shouldn't be coming to work anymore, which was just really a shocking kind of statement to hear. And again, this was a high uncertainty context, and subject matter experts were really needed in these circumstances to help inform what was going on. Not only the microbiologists and the medical professionals, the epidemiologists, but also the social scientists were needed in this circumstance. So let me talk about a couple of the current projects that I'm working on, just so to give you some illustration of the way in which I've approached some of this work. The first project is communicating death and dying in the COVID pandemic. And this was a book chapter that just came out. One of my colleagues from the University of Kentucky jumped very quickly on this and got a contract to put together a handbook on COVID-19 communication. And so this was a very, very rapid response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My co-author on this book is one of my graduate students, and he is also working with Wayne County to try to communicate some of the issues around COVID-19. He was having a lot of challenges in terms of thinking through how best to make information available to the public about what was going on in Wayne County. At the same time, there was a great deal of confusion clearly in around the statistics and the data that was being collected and reported around COVID-19. This followed on some other work that I had done with the Milken School of Public Health from George Washington University around Hurricane Maria. Some of you may recall that during Hurricane Maria, right after Hurricane Maria, the initial death toll that was reported was something like 64 people had died. And the government, the US government celebrated that as a great success, that, you know, we'd managed this hurricane, this devastating hurricane so successfully that only 64 people had died. Well, the people in Puerto Rico knew that that number was wildly inaccurate. And so George Washington University was contracted to do a fuller investigation, a death investigation. I was brought into that project. The final death toll was closer to 3,000. So this was a good example of how there can be these really fundamental distortions in the data that we report around mortality and morbidity, and how that influences our perception of event. So let me talk a little bit about the functions of mortality and morbidity data. It's really important as a fundamental way to understand the level of harm. We look to the number of people who are hurt and the number of people who die from a crisis. It's just a fundamental metric for how much harm has occurred. We also use this data as it occurs in real time to create situational awareness. So we know exactly what's happening, where it's happening, you know, what kind of problems are occurring, so we can address them accordingly. We use this to inform our decisions and response strategies in a variety of ways, including our own personal protective behavior. If I know COVID is really bad in my town, or if it's really bad at Wayne State, I will change my behaviors accordingly. So it's a really important metric to inform decisions, mitigation strategies, and policies. It also allows us to assess the personal, organizational, and community level of risk that is occurring. It'll allow us to determine the impact on specific populations and specific locations. We know that COVID-19 has had a much disproportional impact on the African-American community and Hispanic community. This data can also help to promote and inform preparedness, and it'll help us determine whether or not our interventions are working. So this particular chart that you see on this slide is one of the charts that was developed by my co-author on this paper as a dashboard to help show what was going on in COVID-19. So you see here, maybe a little hard to see because it's too small, the total cases at this point was 18,000. There were 1,200 deaths. You see a map which shows the regional distribution of COVID-19 risk. You see the cases by age. You see the case load by days. So there's a lot of information communicated here that can help individuals and policymakers make some determination of the level of risk that they're facing. Of course, the number of deaths now in Wayne County is close to 2,000. We have over right around 60,000 cases. So these numbers obviously have changed quite significantly. What we typically report in mortality and morbidity data is incidence, prevalence, hospitalizations, and mortality and morbidity. And we do this based on a common case definition. A common case definition is really important because this helps us determine that the death really occurred from this particular disease. And with an emerging disease such as COVID-19, it will be a while before we come up with a common case definition that can allow us to determine how many people have died from this particular disease. Incidence is simply the number of new cases of a disease divided by the population at risk. So that's the incident rate. Prevalence is a measure of the total number of cases of disease in a population at a particular point in time. Another important concept in COVID-19 is comorbidity. This simply means more than one illness or disease occurring in one person at a particular time. You may remember that some of our politicians argued that people weren't really dying from COVID-19, they were dying from other things, and that we were simply counting them as COVID-19 cases, and that's why the mortality rates were so high. The reporting system for disease in this country it's really important to understand. This is the National Notifiable Disease Surveillance System, which is a national system run by the CDC, and it compiles information from local and state public health departments. It's really important to understand that this system we have for disease reporting is very, very decentralized. And it depends on very localized officials with wildly different degrees of training and expertise and resources reporting that data in a timely manner. So this is a very decentralized system, which almost always, by definition, ensures that our reporting is going to lag in time, and that there are going to be significant errors in the reporting because it is such a decentralized system. Particular diseases are identified as required to be reported based on the CDC system. But again, this is a very decentralized system. So what did we see when we looked at the COVID-19 data reporting, and what were some of the factors that we saw going on? Well, there are a number of things that can influence the accuracy of these data, and therefore influence the way we perceive an event and how we manage that particular event. One is simply the fog of war. This was certainly the case in Hurricane Maria. There were significant disruptions to communication systems, a great deal of confusion about what was going on. There was just a lot of noise entered into the system because of the overall level of disruption. Cause of death is also another important factor. I mentioned comorbidities. If someone with significant heart disease dies from COVID-19, what does that say about the actual cause of death? Excess deaths is another interesting variable in reporting of mortality and morbidity. Excess death is a metric of the number of deaths which occurred during any particular event, which exceed what we might expect during that particular event. So the excess deaths around COVID-19 are right now looking to be about a third higher than we might expect just from COVID-19. So we see about 2 million deaths worldwide from COVID-19. The World Health Organization is suggesting that really that number is closer to 3 million because our reporting systems have just not caught the excess deaths that are associated with COVID-19. I already mentioned the problems with a standardized case definition. Until such time as there is a standard case definition, we can't report this data. There are reporting lags in terms of timing. There are real challenges in the public understanding of what is meant by things like incident rate. What does that actually mean? So the public's understanding of these events, really of these data really may be limited. An interesting fact is we do not test cadavers for cause of death. So if someone, or for a disease, for a virus. So if someone were to die at home of COVID-19, we bring that body into a medical facility, we don't test to see what they died from. So we are unlikely to report that as COVID-19. And in this case, many people died at home without being diagnosed as COVID-19, and they were not reported as COVID-19 deaths. This information is compiled from local sources, which I indicated is highly variable in terms of resources and skills. We have variable reporting methods, and then in some case, we have intentional manipulation of the data. This is clearly what's gone on in some of the states. Florida, we have intentionally tried to downplay the number of dead and the number of the amount of disease, and we've done so in a really sort of heavy-handed way. So what are the recommendations we offer from this particular analysis? First of all, standard definitions and standardized reporting systems are necessary to get accurate numbers around mortality and morbidity. We need normative systems of reporting so that everybody knows how this happens and follows a standardized set of norms regarding how this information is reported. We need to test cadavers to be able to get an accurate information about how many people have died from COVID-19 or from other infectious diseases. And the data needs to be in accessible form so that the public can really understand it. The public has limited understanding to the general public to process statistical data. So we need to present this information in a way that is accessible. So that's my project around death and dying and reporting on COVID-19. I never thought I would be writing about mortality and morbidity as a communication problem. But again, as I looked at what was happening with COVID-19, it was clear that there were communication implications. Another project that I'll just review quickly here so we have some time for some questions is a project that's ongoing. And this is a project with colleagues from the University of Maryland and the University of Central Florida. When COVID-19 hit, there were 2 or 3 of us who were in higher education administration who thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see how universities are responding to this as a way to understand how organizations may be managing their response to COVID-19. So we undertook a project to interview university leaders, and we did a national snowball sample of 55 university leaders. We interviewed each twice. And this ranged from small community colleges to a large R1 schools. There were a number of relatively small private religious universities involved. So we got a good range of different kinds of universities, and we collected these interviews. We conducted these interviews between May and October of 2020. So there are 3 papers that we see coming out of this project. One focusing on ethics and values in response to a crisis, a pandemic such as COVID-19. Another focusing on organizational learning from crisis, which is a really interesting topic. And the last one, which is still kind of in development, is a best practices in response, which is really an effort to assess how universities have responded to COVID-19 and whether they've done it well or not. So some of the general conclusions from the study, first of all the leaders that we interviewed reported some significant level of surprise. They were really, really shocked when this happened, which was quite interesting because some of you may remember 10 years ago, we had H1N1, which affected universities quite significantly, and we thought many universities would be closed down. So there was a good example out there of how this might have happened, yet universities were generally caught off guard and very surprised. We also found, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, that many universities followed what we call a track of value, that they really used ethics and value statements to guide their response. We found that active, strong leadership was really important, particularly university leaders who were subject matter experts in the area, such as President Wilson, with his background in medicine, was really helpful in informing a response. There was an effort for active and ongoing learning throughout the case to inform activities. There were collaborative crisis responses, particularly across peer groups, university peer groups, which was a really interesting phenomena in terms of learning. There was rapid adaptation. There was an effort to listen to audiences, faculty, students, alumni, others, to get feedback and there was a high reliance on both internal and external expertise. So one of the papers we're working on, really focuses on this question of ethics around crisis response. And this is really interesting because it's not something that's really been discussed in the crisis literature. When COVID-19 first happened, as I indicated, it created surprise and very high levels of uncertainty. And many universities just didn't have any idea how to respond. And there were no national guidelines coming from the CDC or elsewhere about how colleges and universities should respond. So in an effort to develop a response, many of these organizations turned to their value statements, their mission statements, their strategic plans, or what we call a track of value to sort of inform their response. So what this meant is that organizations, universities that had different missions often had very different responses to COVID-19. For example, very, very intensive R1 schools that had a very strong research mission often privileged the return of principal investigators to campus above everything else. That was the principal place where they put their initial efforts. Other kinds of institutions, research or teaching institutions, had very different approaches. So this is a really interesting conclusion that we found, and the idea that value statements and mission statements can be so fundamental in informing your particular strategic response to a crisis was something that the research literature has not talked about so far. Another project focuses on organizational learning and how a crisis can be a learning event for an organization. Of course, organizational learning has been an important topic in organizational theory for a while. We identified both direct and vicarious learning from universities responding to COVID-19. Direct learning is, of course, based on your own experience, and vicarious learning is learning from what others were doing. Universities turn to their peer groups and put together often peer groups, cohorts of peer groups, to really inform what they were doing. So there would be calls of university leaders and provosts who would say, what are you doing? What are you doing? What's worked for you? So there was a lot of sharing of lessons across institutions based on these peer groups. Diversity appeared to be very, very important in university responses to COVID-19, particularly those universities that were responding to diverse audiences, had diverse student populations, for example, and also those universities that were responding to the Black Lives Matter uprisings. So diversity was really important. Having diversity on the crisis team was important. Leader backgrounds, I already mentioned, subject matter experts were really important in terms of university presidents having expertise in health or epidemiology. A few of the university leaders we talked to actually had some training in crisis response, which was very, very helpful. We had one university leader talk about a workplace shooting, a campus shooting that had happened, and how that had really helped inform what they were doing in response to COVID-19. So subject matter experts, both internal and external, were really important in this organizational learning process. And the last paper that we're working on, which is just now in formulation, I was talking to the co-authors this morning, there's a set of best practices that have been articulated in the area of crisis and emergency risk communication. And there are 10 of them that have been described. And so now we're going back and looking at university responses to see how universities complied with these 10 best practices and in what ways to really do an assessment of, how have universities responded? Has it really been effective? So those are the 3 projects that are coming out of this university project. It's a little bit remarkable to me. I've got such a great group of colleagues and students I'm working with that, we've moved so quickly and we've been able to really get great data and I think really inform our understanding about this. We had a wonderful article written up in Inside Higher Education about this. We had some journalists reach out to us, and we had a great set of interviews around that, which was published about 3 weeks ago. So I finished presentations on crisis communication for the last 20 years or so by talking about the 1918 influenza pandemic, and using it as sort of a cautionary tale and telling people that, you know, this could happen again. I never really thought that I would live through the 1918 pandemic. I never thought that I would have this experience. I also, this is kind of interesting to me. I was thinking about this last night as I was going over my slides. One of my books we were working on recently, we have a chapter on memorializing and grieving around a crisis response, and how communication is very important, and we build monuments, we create public memory around events. But when I was working on a book, I tried to find monuments or memorials to the 1918 influenza pandemic, and they just don't exist. I mean, we've memorialized so many disasters in society: the Titanic, the Shirtwaist Fire in New York, 9/11. We always memorialize disasters, but there isn't a great public memory around the 1918 influenza pandemic. I've often struggled to understand why that is. Part of it is because I think that this event occurred over such a long period of time. Part of it was so devastating that people did not want to remember. But then last night, I watched the ceremony on the reflecting pool where our new president, President Biden, the current president, memorialized the loss from COVID-19. And I thought, you know, how interesting that we're now trying to create an understanding around COVID-19, in part to inform where we go from here. So we have to understand where we've been in terms of understanding where we're going. So I want to thank you very much for listening to me prattle on about 35, 40 years of research. It has been my passion for a very, very long time, and I will be happy to try to take any questions you might have. Thank you for listening to me. And I'm also willing to talk about beekeeping if anybody wants to talk about that.
Okay. Thank you. Jack has a question. Jack, go ahead.
I don't believe I do, but thank you very much for a talk. I'm still sort of processing, but if I do have something, I will make sure to raise my hand virtually.
I thought I saw you.
Thank you, Jack, for joining us.
Anybody else has a question or comment?
Walter, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Matt. That was a really excellent. Presentation, and I have a question that's about sort of that end note that you had about memorializing and grieving, and I was really interested that the other events that you mentioned are memorialized, but longitudinal situations involving disease are less. And I was wondering if you hypothesize that has something to do with our peculiar relationship to the idea of public health, and the way that we have this idea that individuals are responsible for themselves, and that if you catch the disease, that's sort of your fault. And I was wondering if that has changed at all in the current context, that idea of a collective responsibility for protecting the public.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I've started writing about this phenomena a couple times and haven't been able to sort it out enough in my mind to really come up with a clear thesis regarding this issue. You know, there is an effort to understand disease from a sort of collective perspective. We're beginning to talk about community efficacy as opposed to self-efficacy. Community efficacy is the idea that a community is responsible for managing risks, as opposed to self-efficacy, which is really, you know, it's my own problem I need to focus on to come up with solutions for. I think the disease is perceived very differently than these shocking, sudden, short events, which are contained in place and time. A disease can be diffuse. Certainly that has been the case in COVID-19, which creates a different level of perception. I also think that there, certainly with the 1918 influenza, I think there was a real interest in forgetting. So part of memorializing is remembering, and part of memorializing is forgetting. And we come up with a public memory which is politically and socially acceptable around this particular event. And the pandemic of 1918 was so devastating. Whole communities were lost in that particular pandemic that we just, I think in many cases, we just wanted to forget and move on. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why we failed to learn the lessons of the 1918 pandemic, is because we did not memorialize and grieve. So you may recall, or may not, that on the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic, the CDC tried to mount a major campaign about the pandemic to help people understand that this risk was real and it was still out there and it could happen again. You may not remember that because that campaign was largely unsuccessful. And so, there's a really interesting public memory, memorializing, remembering, and forgetting phenomena, which is manifest around here. And some of my colleagues in rhetoric have looked at these issues, and the visual rhetoricians have looked at the various monuments that we build. So it's a really interesting area of work.
Thank you, Matt. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Matt, one of the things I've been interested in finding a theoretical approach to is sort of why some people don't wear masks, even though there's clearly something that would help. I mean, apart from the politicizing of it. And I think you pointed to something about the Spanish flu and the Black Death. I don't think you meant, perhaps you didn't mention, which was quite predictable in the sense that like 1 in 5 people died. I mean, and people were seeing around them people dying, whereas there are whole groups of people that never had any, let's say for the COVID. I mean, I was talking to my wife this morning, and I said, we are lucky that there's nobody in our family that died. And we listened to somebody last night. We were looking at in our program, and one person that was interviewed in CNN said that 5 people from her family died. So is that a way of explaining it, that this particular disease is so, I think you said unfair, but there might be another term for it that results in people not taking it as seriously as they should?
So there's a lot to unpack there. And I do think understanding why people do not take subject matter expert recommendations is a critical question. As I said, I was talking to a reporter this morning about vaccinations and why we have vaccination reticence and why people aren't going to do that. There is a very strong political force around mask wearing, and it has become, for God knows what reason, politicized, so that if you wear a mask, you are a liberal Democrat, and if you don't, you are a conservative Republican. I don't know how we got to that point. I know that certain politicians pushed that particular image of mask wearing. So there is that whole level associated with it. There's also in this country a very strong stream of sort of, I will do nothing that the government tells me to do. So if the government tells me to wear a mask, the last thing I'm going to do is wear a mask, because how dare you impede on my right to as an individual. So when I've talked about this with the press, I've said, indeed, people have a right not to wear masks. We can pass legislation, but the reality is that it's unlikely we're going to be able to force people to wear masks. People have choices. They can also choose and go and lick doorknobs if they choose to, which is a great way to get the disease. So, there is this notion of my own personal choice in these circumstances. And I think overlaid on all of this, Walter, is the distrust of science. And I think I point to, there's always been a stream of distrust of science, but I think the climate debates have really been important in understanding the larger distrust of science. There was a very concerted effort to undermine the credibility of scientists and subject matter experts around the climate debate. And that's, I believe, now been generalized to other areas, including around public health recommendations. But I think we really need to understand why people are choosing these particular behaviors and what factors can influence them. Know from the vaccine studies, vaccine reticence studies, that if you try to simply give people who are vaccine deniers more information, more science, more data, that simply hardens their opinions and their attitudes. And a much more effective strategy appears to be narrative in terms of getting them to change their opinions, because they develop their opinions based on personal stories and personal anecdotes. They did not develop their opinions based on science and data. So if you give them more science and data, it's not going to change their opinions. I sometimes say to my students, if I don't get a lot of questions, I feel like a failure. So,
I have a question.
Yes, thank you.
I remember President Trump tried to reframe it as the China virus. And I kind of thought if that might have created another whole kind of reticence when you give it a kind of racist tone already, and you're already placing blame on the disease beyond its origin to other reasons.
So I talked about stigmatization. And clearly, stigmatization is a factor associated with many diseases, many infectious diseases. So the Ebola virus was, of course, associated with people from parts of Africa. H1N1 was associated with people who were from Mexico and South and Central America. So diseases are often associated with particular ethnic groups in a stigmatizing way. This actually makes it much more difficult to manage that disease because it drives the disease underground. And clearly, you heard this, Mr. Trump, the former president, tried to cut off travel from China. Well, any epidemiologist will tell you by the time he did that, it was too late. The disease was already in this country. And it made it much more difficult to track the disease or to get resources for tracking the disease in and out of China by cutting off all travel. So the stigmatization is a real problem in the management of these diseases, but it typically happens, it is a common feature of infectious diseases.
Yeah, I have.
But thank you for that question.
Yeah, I have a question on the cry wolf phenomenon, which I think was going on about a year ago. I remember when I first heard about the COVID, I thought, well, okay, we went through SARS and we went through bird flu and a bunch of others and nothing really happened. I remember feeling pretty complacent, and I thought a lot of other people were too. And then when people learned that, yeah, there really is a wolf, but I'm thinking here that was captured politically such that only some people were saying there's a real wolf. And as soon as that happened, then you had the political polarization. And I think then it became a symbolic thing. So I'm wondering if, first of all, the cry wolf raises the threshold. Do you have an opinion about communication in these kind of situations? And then how do you overcome the polarization where it takes on a symbolic issue? Wearing a mask is a symbol now.
Sure.
And if you don't like the group that wears masks, well, then you're not going to take part in it. So I'm wondering if the message has to be tilted to different groups, or I'm not sure how you deal with that.
So let me talk about the last part of your question first and then get back to the cry wolf phenomenon. So one of the fundamental principles of effective communication is tailoring the message to the audience. And so understanding the particular reasons why an audience holds an opinion is fundamental to changing that opinion. We know that there is a variety of messaging around public health interventions like mask wearing. Sometimes we say, wear masks not to protect yourself, but to protect the community. And that appeals to some of us who have a very strong communitarian orientation. You know, I want to wear a mask not to protect myself, but to protect my family and my neighbors and others. And then there are others who don't share that particular value of communitarianism. They're very much grounded in individualism. And so for those people, we say masks protect you. So wear a mask to protect yourself. And we've seen both of those kinds of messages associated with COVID-19, and they're targeted to different audiences. There are a variety of other kinds of message strategies we've used. We've used fear appeals, we've used emotional appeals, we've done a variety of different things to try to reach those particular audiences. And that's what we need to do. We need to use different spokespersons, different channels, different messages, tailoring those to the specific audiences we're trying to reach. As I said, right now, we expect about 60% of the public may take vaccines. We need to get to at least 70% of the public to have herd immunity. We roughly vaccinate in a good year 50% of the people for influenza. So we have a lot of work to do to get to 70% of the public around vaccines. So the cry wolf phenomenon I ground within the very extensive body of literature on warning systems. And what we see in warning systems, if we look, for example, at evacuation warnings around hurricanes, we have a lot of data around, you know, when people evacuate and why they evacuate and how they evacuate. And we know that if you issue warnings that are then not manifest by an actual risk over a period of time, that's going to reduce evacuation behaviors. Okay, so if we tell people a hurricane's coming, you got to get out, and then nothing happens, if we do that 2 or 3 times in a row, we know that the evacuation behaviors will dissipate over time. So it's not surprising that we perceived the COVID-19 risk as it was first emerging within the context of those other infectious diseases that I mentioned, like H1N1. You know, there was a prediction that H1N1 would get very bad, and we got very lucky that it did not get very bad. But a lot of people were able to say, oh, this is just another H1N1 or another Ebola. So the accuracy of risk and warning messages is important, and particularly in terms of how the larger ecosystem of understanding of risks exists in the public. So I hope that addresses your question.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for me?
Matt, I have a question.
Yes.
A number of the points that you've been making in response to questions are about best practices in health communication generally, that we would tailor messages, we would engage in motivational interviewing and narrative forms of communication in order to evoke behavior change. But the effort that some of those communication strategies demand versus the timeliness of a crisis communication strategy. And your first principle was a tolerance for ambiguity. And those seem to be a bit of a paradox. Can you kind of reconcile how individual health behavior communication and crisis communication strategies to some degree seem at odds with each other?
So I have a paper on this topic, which I'd be happy to share with you at some point, but there is a body of literature in risk communication, which we typically think of as more, you know, the health communication, the general health communication practices, and then we have crisis communication, which is somehow separate. We've tried to merge those two and say they're part of a larger process. And I have a paper that focuses on this that I'd be happy to share with you. One of the ways in which we approach this inherent conflict, and it is a contradiction and a conflict, is with the principle of strategic ambiguity. And that is that we need to maintain sufficient ambiguity in our message systems to reflect the fact that these circumstances are going to emerge in ways that we don't understand, that we don't know. So for example, we can say in a risk message around a crisis, based on what we currently know, this is what we think of as the appropriate strategy for you to take. Our best scientists now, our best science now says do X. As we learn more, we will update you around those circumstances. So that's it's a nuanced message, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the inherent uncertainty in a circumstance in a health message as we go forward. I think audiences ultimately will appreciate that. So strategic ambiguity. It's what administrators are really good at as well. So I think
we have one more question by Jeff. I think you put it in the chat box if you wanted to unmute, and that could be our last question.
Always ask at right last the pole position. Matt, echo the sentiments of others. Very, very interesting body of work and some great insights here. Quick question. So once we're past that ambiguity point, because a number of the conversations around what we're still dealing with, to what extent does the absence of I'm using the term here in a different context than it's usually used, but an authoritarian structure where there's a singular message coming through the system, a unified message coming through the system. When the media itself, the medium, is so fragmented and potentially so distorted, how do you process that through then, right? So even if President Biden starts sending this regular message, you still have this fragmented ambient distortion machine, right? So just wondering how that plays out. I'm always interested in the arc over time, and I know that's embedded in your research, but I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and the first thing I will offer in response is describe the system that was built by the Centers for Disease Control after the 9/11 anthrax letter episode. So I mentioned this episode earlier on. The CDC was wildly and profoundly ineffective in terms of its communication around the anthrax letters. They made all kinds of just horrific mistakes. It was really very, very sad to see what had happened. And there was a real introspection and effort to learn from that and build a new system of communication to accommodate these kinds of emergencies in the future. It was a very centralized system. The CDC would develop the messages based on science, would vet those messages, and then release those to the public and through a system of communication that involved public health partners. So the messages were released in ways so that they could be rebranded by your state health department, by your local health department, by your church, by your synagogue, by your company, your organization. They offered guidances to hospitals, to universities, to community colleges, to organizations, companies, manufacturing companies. So it was a really comprehensive system of communication, which allowed messages to then be reframed or retargeted based on individuals' needs. And I remember quite vividly working with the CDC when they decided to put their messages in a format so that the CDC logo could be removed from a flyer, for example, and you could drop in Wayne State University's flyer logo on that flyer. So it's a way to rebrand that particular message. So that whole system fell apart under Trump. My friends at the CDC told me that when he came in, he required that every message that was released to the public be vetted by the White House before it was released. And the CDC was they'd never done that before. It was completely novel. And the CDC, my colleagues at the CDC told me that only about 20% of the messages that they were preparing were ever released by the White House, ever approved for release. So that whole system fell apart under that circumstance. we're always going to see people, the churning of messages, particularly with such a fragmented media system. We're always going to see, messages distorted and reframed based on a particular political ideology or slant. I don't know how to address that problem other than to flood the zone with as much information as possible. So I don't think the answer to this is less communication. I think the answer is more communication that is consistent through public health partners, so that there is an overwhelming body of work. One of the things, now you've sort of got me off, Jeff. You do this often to me. You kind of got me off on a tangent here. So we'll be here for the next 45 minutes for anybody who's interested. One of the things that happens in a crisis, I've talked about the uncertainty condition, but the uncertainty condition creates an intense need for communication, an intense need for information to reduce the uncertainty. There's, at the very time, there is often an absence of information. We don't know what's happening. We don't have information to be able to address that particular uncertainty. Sometimes our channels of communication have been disrupted, so we don't have the means for delivering that information. So there's just a variety of ways where the whole communication environment around a crisis is disrupted. However, even in that very uncertain, very disrupted moment, we still have an obligation to communicate and to give as much information and to create perceptions of transparency and openness as possible. Now, I'm going to talk about both one of the best and one of the worst examples of crisis communication I can think of, and that is Rudy Giuliani. You may remember Rudy Giuliani before he became whatever he is now. In 9/11, he was a very effective communicator around 9/11. He stood up in front of the media twice a day. And he said, I don't have a lot of information to provide you. I can give you some updates on what we're doing at the World Trade Center, but I'm here to try to answer your questions to create as much transparency as possible. And that was very effective in the sense of flooding the zone with information. Governor Cuomo has tried to do the same with COVID-19, and to some extent has been very effective. So that's my answer. More communication, hopefully that is consistent and grounded in science. And if we have a centralized system, authoritarian, as you described, system of communication, we may be more effective in that regard.
Well,
We're going to continue this offline.
I hope so.
I think we should join. I hope you can join me in thanking Matt for his wonderful talk. It shows that he is an engaged, very enthusiastic scholar. He's written a lot, he is mentoring a lot, and he is a good person to lead the charge in terms of faculty research and student research. He's leading from in front, which is a good way to lead. So thank you, Matt. Kennedy has a little speech that she gives at the end. And so,
yeah, thank you so much. This was a very, very important presentation. I'm glad that we have it recorded because it's so much information, very well crafted. And just for everyone, this is being recorded and we'll upload it to our website just in case anyone missed it. But a very well presentation. It's always glad to have you as a speaker and as a guest and as a friend of the Humanities Center. And as a small token of our gratitude, we do have 2 gifts for you, a journal and a mask that we give all of our guest speakers, and we'll be reaching out to you towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to you due to COVID. It's kind of hard. We wish we could give it to you in person, but we do have these for you, and we're so very thankful to have speakers like you and to have this platform where you can share this wealth of knowledge. Again, we'll be uploading this presentation towards the end of the week. It will be on our website. Thank you all for coming. I know today is inauguration day, but you had a great turnout, and look how many individuals still stayed after the meeting, so, but then again, thank you so much. And if you have any last words, we can close it out.
I just want to thank you again, Kennedy, and thank you, Professor Edwards, for creating this opportunity for me and for all you've done for Wayne State and for the Humanities Center. The Humanities Center is quite a gem of this university. So thank you very much. Great to see so many colleagues, and please stay safe and wear your masks.
Okay, Mary.
Wear your mask. All right, everyone have a good one and be safe. And we're so happy you could join us today.